Hello, Tank fans, and welcome to Totally Tanked, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. I'm Rob, and I'm here with...
Hello, my name is John.
And we're talking about tanks today. John, what should we be talking about, the Lee or the Grant?
The M3 Medium is its correct name, Rob.
The M3 Medium Tank Lee/Grant. All sorts of different names. We'll have fun with the...
Coffin for 7 brothers.
We will have fun with the names of what it's called later. But right now, we're going to talk about T-shirts.
Yes, you can get Totally Tanked T-shirts at redbubble.com. The one thing I would say is if you search for Totally Tanked, just make sure the seller is Totally Tanked. There's some dude in Madagascar who's making really bad T-shirts that have the words Totally Tanked on them. And given that we don't own the trademark to that because there's a lot of aquarium supply stores that call themselves Totally Tanked, we're probably going to have to let that one go because he's not stealing our designs. But just saying, our T-shirts are way better and you just want the seller to be Totally Tanked.
There we go.
Here we go.
But yes, we'd love to have more T-shirts sold. I'm still rocking mine.
Yeah, you're wearing it today, Rob. Looking very sharp. Your Matilda shirt.
My Matilda, old and slow, all the way to the end.
Yep. And I would also say, folks, do if you buy a shirt or any of the merchandise, the ways you can get our stuff from Redbubble, then send us a photo of yourself with it and we will share it on our Facebook and Twitter.
Show how cool you look in it.
Yeah. I would say we're in the quite unusual position where we have far more people listen to the podcast than follow us on social media. And normally these things go completely the reverse of that because it's quite easy to get social media listeners and quite hard to get podcast listeners. So
we love you all.
If you're listening and you can tolerate Facebook, we do little things like, for example... each month we post a silhouette of a tank, which is going to be the next month's podcast, and ask people to guess it. And there's a lot of fun had. In this case, not only did quite a lot of people guess the tank correctly, but Sean in Canada, his 11-year-old son, correctly identified which specific M3 medium was silhouetted. Well done.
Well done, Sean's son. Alrighty, so the M3 Lee/Grant, the Iron Cathedral. If you want some turrets and cupolas on your tank, you've got a wall of them.
Even the turrets have turrets.
Even the turrets have turrets. The Iron Cathedral, as they call it.
And yet somehow they managed to not put the main gun in any of them.
For those people who don't know, the M3 Medium was a stopgap designed to fill a space from 1942 to 1943 where the Americans hadn't quite figured out how to build a M4 Sherman yet.
It's quite weird because by 1938, the Germans and the British had both arrived at what we still think of as a conventional tank layout.
Yes.
Which is to say 4 crew, you have a driver, you have a gunner, you have a loader and a commander. And the gunner, loader and commander sit in the turret and the driver sits at the front of the tank. And the Matilda followed this pattern. The Panzer III was there. And modern day tanks to this day, plus or minus having a loader versus an autoloader, all still follow this pattern. And yet...
the Americans also follow that pattern for their M3 Light. The Stuart had all those sort of things. But their M3 Medium did not. Yeah,
now I like to think of the M3 as a bunch of really good tank components put together really badly. It had taken each piece. There's a lot to really like about it together. The main problem, of course, is it's a crew of 7.
So for those people who really, really have no idea about this tank,
it
is. It's got a crew of 7 or 6, depending.
Well, let's go with the 7, which is the Lee variant.
Yeah. Right. So we've got a 37mm cannon in a turret on top of the tank.
You've got a little turret on top of the turret with a machine gun in it.
Yes, another 30 cal in it, and you've also got a coax 30 cal in the turret with the 37mm.
So the commander can be spraying 30mm in different directions at the same time.
Well, the gunner and the commander.
Okay, anyway, they're in the turret firing the machine guns in different directions. Yep.
You've also got in the hull, they've got a hull-mounted sponson. I think World War One Mark V style sponson with a 75mm gun in that.
Look, if Warhammer 40,000 came out with this tank model, people would be like, that's way too far-fetched. no one would be so foolish as to build a vehicle that looked like this.
All right,
so a sponson-mounted gun on the right-hand side which has limited ability to traverse quite good elevation and depression, but limited traverse.
7 degrees left and right. So, think a tank destroyer type maneuverability on the sponson, and 20 degrees up, 7 degrees down, or something like that.
And as designed, a pair of machine guns to the left of the driver that could be fired by triggers on the top of the driver's...
Now, these were fixed guns, so only pointed forwards, but it was the driver who controlled them. So the driver could slew the tank left and right to spray machine guns anywhere he felt like, because he had the buttons on his driving levers to fire them off. So, and then you could also mount another 50 cal anti-aircraft on the back of the turret.
Because why not?
Yes, because if you can't have more machine guns, I mean, this is... just remember, at this point in the beginning of the war, when the Americans were still out of it, they were still running around with the idea that tanks were a delivery system for a hell of a lot of machine guns. That was what they built. They built tanks with 8 machine guns on them. Yeah,
I mean, this was literally an evolution of the M2, which has been described by many as a self-propelled machine gun nest.
Yeah.
And I think it had 2 rear-firing sponsons for machine guns. It had in total, I think, 8 machine guns, as you mentioned. And I mean, a lot of people, and even modern-day movie makers trying to depict warfare, there's an idea that the machine gun is this terrifying, all-conquering, all-destroying weapon. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to have someone shooting a machine gun at me. But the reality is, if your company is advancing and you get lit up by a machine gun, a lot of people get injured. There's a lot of screaming. It's extremely unpleasant. But a lot of people go home and write war poetry about how terrible it was. Whereas if your advancing company gets lit up by a battery of artillery, everyone just dies and no one writes any poems about it.
Yes.
And so even though I think in World War One it was 80% of casualties were caused by artillery, and I also believe it's...
mainly disease, but those that weren't disease related probably was artillery.
Yeah, and also I think it was 10,000 rounds of ammunition fired for every casualty. It was
as in bullets or as in artillery?
Bullets. Okay. Yeah. You fired an enormous number of bullets to actually hit the enemy, mostly because they were sitting in trenches. Maybe sticking their hat over the top on a stick to get you to draw your fire. But the point is, the machine gun is a very useful weapon. I'm not questioning that its utility at all. But there is in the public imagination, and quite obviously in the American planning establishment in the interwar period, an idea that the machine gun was the ultimate weapon on the battlefield, when in fact, as everyone knows,
it's HE.
Artillery is the lord of battle.
Yeah.
But what this meant was that you had the M2, which had the 400 horsepower right radial engine, basically an aircraft engine mounted in it. You had the drivetrain that would go on to become the M3, and also, frankly, pretty similar in the M4. So, all from the deck down, they pretty much had sorted out a really good tank design by the time of the M2. They just hadn't figured out what to put above the tracks. And it was very sound, very powerful, fine, except they were saying we can't get a big gun in a turret. We don't know how to do it.
They hadn't quite figured out. So they knew how to make a 75mm gun, but they didn't know how to build a turret that would house it. So when the design started in June of 1940, after the fall of France, they said, right.
And also, when the British said, we want 1 million tanks right away, and
we'll get you 3,600. All right, and then we're going to say, okay, what do we want? Well, we need a 75mm gun in a turret. We can't do it. We can't do that in a turret. But what we can do is put it in a sponson, get it to you in a year's time, and after that, we'll have something developed. And so they went off and built the M3 tank, which has the 75mm gun in the sponson, because they couldn't figure out how. They didn't have the wherewithal to be able to put it into the turret at that time, and they didn't want to waste time coming up with a design for being able to put it into a turret, rather than when they needed tanks, when the British needed tanks right then and there. So they said, right, it's better to have a tank with a gun and a sponson now than waiting for one, than having one on paper that you can't actually use.
Yeah, let's get into the difference between the Grant and the Lee here, which they're both British designations. To the Americans, they were always M3 mediums, although American troops almost certainly did start picking up the British usage as things went on. So the Lee is notionally the American version, although the British...
We'll get into that.
The British did use Lees and the Americans did use Grants. It's the one with the little machine gun turret on top of the 37mm turret. And it doesn't have... The radio operator is in the main body of the tank, which brought the crew numbers up to the ludicrous 7, which I was saying to Rob off mic is basically an armoured personnel carrier at that point. But
so for those 7 positions, we've got the commander, the 37mm gunner, the 37mm...
The upper gunner.
Yeah.
And then the lower gunner.
Yeah. The 37mm gunner, the loader, the 75mm gunner and loader, the driver, and then the radio operator. The British, in their version,
So they lengthened the top turret
yeah,
to put a radio bustle in the back.
because they wanted the commander to have access to the radio, which I thought was a great idea. So that meant they didn't have to have a radio operator in the hull, so it reduced the crew to 6.
Yeah. I mean, I've got to say, the concept of operations of a very junior enlisted person on the radio getting orders from company headquarters... and then
they're also a specialist, and that's their one job.
Yeah, but trying to relay that to the commander up in the turret in a sensible way and then return his instructions, it just sometimes is a lot easier just to pick up the phone yourself.
Yeah. With their hull-mounted driver-controlled machine guns, they were very quickly found to be rubbish, and
very bad idea.
And everybody took them out and just welded over that hole in the hole in the hull.
Yeah. Now, I've been thinking about...
The Grants also had a vision slit on the left or right hand, I can't remember which one, for the commander to be able to see out and have... Because he didn't have a cupola, he only had a hatch in his turret, he needed increased visibility, and so they had another vision slit for the commander.
Yeah, and there were little pop-out pistol ports all over the thing and hatches in the side. Despite being covered in hatches and ports, it was also, I mean, this is one of the reasons the Russians hated it. If it caught fire, which it was prone to do, it was extremely hard to get out of, which, you know, led to a lot of letters home. But riveted armour is a subject of frequent complaint about this tank and any other tank that was riveted, and we've discussed in the past that obviously welded is better and riveted is bad because the rivets are a spalling hazard. If the tank takes a heavy hit, then...
even if it doesn't penetrate...
Bits of rivet fly around the inside of the tank. I have been thinking about welding armour plate lately, and I've actually been looking it up and seeing what even modern welders talk about it. And the problem you've got with welding armour plate is that you take your welder and you run a bead around the outside of the armour, and you're not actually joining the two plates of armour together. You're only joining a millimetre around the outside. And what you're actually best off to do, and this is what they do in warship design as well, is be bolting the armour plate onto an internal frame and flush fitting it, rather than, and which means you can also replace bits. That's the ideal, rather than welded construction actually has a lot of problems because the heat of the welding also destroys the tempering all around where you do the welds. So your face hardening goes to hell. Having said that, combat experience would show welding is still superior to riveting, but it's not quite as clear-cut as it can seem at first.
Big benefit of the riveting, though, it was much quicker to make them with.
And you know, skills and things like that. Yeah.
So, and this really was having come up, started the design in June of 1940. They started rolling them out in production in August of 1941, and so very very quick design. And building straight into production in just over 12 months, and then production only lasted until December of 42. And in that time, they built 6,200 of them. Most of those half of them were just destined for the UK forces in North Africa, and they got there just in time for them to be able to hold off Rommel. And we'll get into that in a little bit.
Not hold off Rommel at Gazala, but yeah.
they helped. But the main thing is so of the 6,200 built, what have we got? We got 2,800 went sent to the UK, 1,300, almost 1,400 sent to Russia. However, 400 of those were lost at sea. Of the 2,800 that went to the UK, these are the Lees these are the Grants. Now, the reason why the British have a different version is that they came along and said, what we want in the tank is this, this, and this, and they wanted the Americans to build them some more Matildas and Valentines, and the Americans said, no, we're not doing that. We're going to build our own tanks. Thanks very much.
Yeah, and it was very much a case of the British being shown the M3 and saying, we really don't want that, and the Americans saying, this is what you're getting if you want anything, and the British saying, can we have some changes, please? Yeah. And the Americans saying, you can have very minor changes.
Now, just remember, America's not in the war at this stage. They're just selling armaments.
Yeah, I mean, at one level, America's not in the war. At another level, American finance is the only thing keeping the British government out of bankruptcy. Yeah. So, at some levels, it's almost a single nation economically. At other levels, politically, very different. And the American public still doesn't know that they've actually essentially entered World War II.
And the American tank force at this stage was like 400 M2 lights.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. So not the thousands of tanks that the British lost at Dunkirk, or the Russians had.
Yeah,
or the
Germans Americans did not have
tank force.
any real functional tanks, and the M2 is a classic one when historians, particularly military vehicle historians, sort of suck their teeth and say, well, it wasn't that bad, and it was still useful for training. And anytime they say it was useful for training, that means it was terrible. It was an absolute stinker. But it was useful for training means there was literally nothing else they could do with it. But
speaking of useful for training, the M3 Lees, M3 Grants were of the 2,800 that were given to the UK. By the time the M4 Shermans were available and they started replacing the M3 Lees in theatre, the UK sent 1,700 of their tanks to Australia. So that we could use them for training, because we could have deployed some of them, but we didn't actually end up deploying any of our.
Is this where we're going to talk about the mythical 1st Armoured Division?
No, not yet.
Okay.
No, just talking about where these things went to and who got them. So
yeah, I mean, it's also worth noting though that for all the many failings of Matilda, Australia kept using Matilda in combat roles in the Pacific all the way to the end of the war, whereas with the M3 it was like, no.
that was our training tank, right?
To get them ready for Matildas.
we didn't deploy those.
Which indicates it really had some problems.
Right. It might have just not fit on our shipping containers or whatever it is. Yeah. But they also had the other 900 were sent to India to join up with the Indian forces, and they had great success in Burma. Which we'll talk about. Yeah, well,
the tanks are all relative, aren't they? Mm. And compared to Japanese Type 95s...
the Hagos, yep.
An M3 was a fine and wonderful tank, although the Japanese did get very good at attacking it from the side where the gun wasn't.
Yes.
Because they're quite cunning like that, aren't they? Because I'm not aware of, and I'm sure someone, Tasman probably, or one of the other listeners knows of cases where the Germans deliberately targeted the off-gun side of the M3, but the Japanese definitely were doing that very quickly. Mm.
Now, talking about the naming of it, the Lee, the Grant, and so forth, while the UK tanks were supposed to be the M3 Grants, there were plenty that were actually Lees and vice versa. So, yes, there is a lot of crossover between what tanks were used, what they were called, and nobody really cared about the designations because they were very interchangeable.
And it gets more complicated for your modelers and historians in that plenty of units got converted to M4 Shermans as quickly as possible, but then when their Shermans got blown up, there were M3s available in theatre, so they were re-equipped with M3s. So even units that are converted to M4s can then be turning up on the battlefield months later in M3s, which can certainly make it seem more complicated. And beyond that, you had different factories manufacturing the things, but the parts commonality was good enough that different parts from different factories were brought them. So for modelers, it's pretty much free reign. You can you can mix and match bits, and if anyone wants to say, "Oh, that was never deployed with that one," be like, "Are you sure?"
The Detroit Tank Factory produced most of them. Of the 1600, they produced about half of them.
Yeah, the railway companies produced a bunch as well. The Pullman Company and another one.
So one of the differences for the M3 from a lot of other tanks at this stage was the height of it, John. It was a massive wall of steel rising up and up and up and up.
Yes.
Over 10 feet high.
And with no capacity to go hull down because the gun was very low in the body of it.
Yeah, so the sponson gun was on the hull, so you can't go hull down because even if you are at the top of a hill, you might be able to hide your tracks, but the top half of your tank is still all available.
I mean, in theory, you could still be doing something like having the tank concealed, so only the commander and the gunner and the top turret, the top gunner. Sorry, Top Gunner. There's a movie. Can be looking, and then when you decide to engage, you rev the tank forwards and fire and pull back up, which is quite similar to modern tank doctrine of moving up and back, but obviously harder. Now, it did have a stabilizer, which apparently worked really well on the main gun.
Yes, so if you ever see the main gun, the 75mm, with a bit of metal stuck around the...
that's the counterweight, yeah.
The counterweight around the end of the barrel, that's not a muzzle brake. It's it is actually a counterweight so that the barrel doesn't bounce around as much and the stabilizer.
That was the earliest version needed that because it was a shorter gun, and then they went to a slightly longer gun, which didn't need the counterweight, but it actually had a electronic stabilization system, a mechanical stabilization system, which apparently was really good. The trouble was it was so secret and classified that very few troops were ever issued the documents on how to use it.
No, and given no training because they weren't getting out, so they didn't know how to use it once they got in theatre, and really proved no benefit whatsoever.
Well, apparently for the very few units that did get hold of the documents, apparently they had to ferret around and write lots of letters, and finally was sent the manuals. It was extremely useful, but most units never used it and just left it switched off because if you don't know how to use it, it probably isn't going to work, which is a classic thing with any equipment in any team. You've got to be able to train for it to make it useful. Which they had similar problems with the stabilizer system on the M4 Sherman, which again most troops never figured out how to use it and never got the documentation on how to use it, and so said this thing's rubbish. We're not going to use it
because they were training on M2s.
Well, yeah, that didn't help either.
All right, so it's 10 feet high. It's over 8 feet wide. It's 18 feet long. It's got 51 mils of armour on the front, so it's good amount for. Remember, at this beginning part of the war, we're still in the early stages of the. We call it mid-war, I guess, from 40.
I'd call it mid-war after the fall of France.
It's 42 to 43. It's got still a decent amount of armour of 2 inches, 51 on the front. Yeah, 38 mils on the sides.
That's like half of a Matilda's armour, though.
Yeah, but just remember the Germans are running around with less than that.
Sure. Yeah.
The 75mm gun does have HE, so the Poms were very happy about having access to HE rounds.
Yeah, because they could finally clear out anti-tank guns.
Yes, because they could finally clear out anti-tank guns. It also had anti-tank rounds, but the 37mm gun was mainly used for the anti-tank role. But it could also mount a canister round, which was found very effective in Burma and the jungles, because it could clear out jungle and any infantry that might be hiding in there.
Again, this is one of the funny things where this tank gets quite weird, particularly for, again, your modelers and wargamers, is at the start of the war, the upper gun was intended for anti-tank work and the lower gun was intended as basically a high explosive lobber. By the end of its use, the lower gun had finally been fitted with armor-piercing rounds and was the better weapon for anti-tank work, but the upper gun was the only one that fired the canister round, which is essentially a giant shotgun. So that became the anti-personnel weapon. So the guns actually swapped over their usage in it as it rumbled on through the war.
And look, it's so other things it could do. 42 k's an hour on road or 26 k's an hour off road. Had almost 200 k's worth of range.
Came with tank transporters. Yeah. So when the British ordered them, they arrived with great big trucks that would pull them. And similarly, I posted this on our Facebook page. a picture of the mythical and to be discussed Australian 1st Armoured Division on the move, because there was basically, in the British Empire, no trucks were built that could carry more than a 5-ton load because they didn't want to put the railways out of business. And suddenly these tanks turned up with trucks essentially fitted with.
And not to mention they probably wouldn't fit on the railway carriages either.
Yeah, they'd be quite tricky on the railway carriages, but so, the huge change, because in Australia in 1941, when we're desperately thinking how we're going to build a tank, we were literally looting Cadillac dealerships to get Cadillac petrol engines and mounting them in 3 of them in a cloverleaf to power the Australian Sentinel tank. And a year later, the M3s turn up with trucks, with the engine in the truck was more powerful than any engine that existed in the country up until then. And I just shudder to think these things were rumbling from Puckapunyal in Victoria to Geraldton, up in the north of Western Australia at...
about 5,000 kilometres for those people who want to guess. It's a long way.
5,000 hot, dusty kilometres with not a lot of sealed road back in 1942.
No, there's not.
And they would have been rumbling along at top speed, 30 miles an hour.
John, I really think it probably would have been down to Victoria, down to Melbourne, onto a ship, and then by ship around to Geraldton. I don't think we had the capacity to drive that far.
Anyway, we've got the picture of the tanks on the transporters.
Yes, I'm sure the transporters were taking them to Melbourne to get on board a ship.
Yeah, but I mean, anyway, the transporters were for the British Empire use, throughout Australia, throughout the UK, themselves marvels of engineering, being a truck that could carry a 40-ton load.
There you go. So yeah, it only weighed 27 tons. Though.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's. So
I mean, it's a lot of tank for 27 tons.
It is. It is. I mean, it doesn't have that thick an armour, so it does cut it down quite. So the radial 9 400 horsepower engine is what it had. As you said, it's an aircraft engine.
Which, I mean, that was the the reference design and the standard one. There was a weird version where they used 5 L shaped diesels, rotating them around the crankshaft. There was a lot of strange arrangements through this tank's life in the engine bay. Yeah,
well, that was why it had to be so tall and most American tanks had to be so tall as to fit this radial 9 engine into it, because it however it's built, it basically sits up very, very tall.
Yeah, and
you've got to then put the armour around your engine.
Radial engines, obviously the height, making your tank big, boxy, and high has some big penalties because you're a big, easy target, and the Sherman had this problem too. But at the same time, an air-cooled engine does simplify your engine bay. You're not being mobility killed by radiator failures. They could just crank out 400 horsepower, and when everyone knows that the engine is a 400 horsepower engine, then you can design around that. It's a bit like how the Russians have been designing around their Kharkov, aluminium diesel engines for 70 plus years.
Okay. Just want to get into a little bit of the disambiguation of the M3 designation. So we've had a little bit of fun with this.
Okay. I need another beer before we get into this, Rob. Just hang on a sec.
All right.
All right, Rob. So, tell us about all the things the US Army likes to call M3.
There's a few. So, you have the Tank Medium M3, which is the Lee Grant that we've been discussing. You also have the Tank Light M3, which is the Stuart. You have the Half-Track M3 and the many, many, many variations of the M3 Half-Track. You have the M3 Scout Car. You have the M3 Submachine Gun. You have the M3 Carbine for night fighting, which for 1940 was a very complicated piece of handheld rifle with a lot of scopes and great big things stuck on top of it.
Very heavy batteries, I believe.
Yep, and it allowed you to see in the dark. You also had the M3 50 cal Browning.
Not to be confused with the M2, which I was confused by.
Yep. Yeah. There was a anti-tank gun, M3, that came in the 37, 75 and 90mm versions. There was also an aircraft gun called the M3, and then in later years, this is all during World War II, and then later years you also had the M3 Carl Gustaf 84mm anti-tank rocket, recoilless rifle. Well, no, it's rocket.
It's a recoilless rifle?
No, it's a rocket.
Anyway.
Then you have the M3 Spallini, some sort of Italian shotgun, and finally the M3 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. So you'd say to the US military, you know, there are other letters and other numbers than M3 that you can use to designate as part of your military arsenal.
It's a lot, and particularly because this tank was the M3, it had the M3 75mm cannon. It also, I believe, had an M3 sight somewhere on it. You just think in terms of ordering things, it's opening yourself up to trouble.
It really was, and you think I know, clear designation. There probably is a longer naming convention for these things, such as tank medium M3. 1942, whatever, painted green. But the point being is that if you have something that if you put on your docket, I need to have 100 M3s delivered to North Africa by the end of the week, and suddenly you're getting a bunch of night fighting carbines turn up rather than medium tanks, you'd be a little bit disappointed in your supply system.
Yeah, well, it's it literally happens. It still happens. I mean, there's stories about quartermasters trying to order 200 rifle cleaning kits, and the initial for rifle cleaning kit, I think it was some sort of landmine, and so what are we going to do with all of these?
Play hopscotch, yeah.
So it's not trivial, and it does happen that if these things can get easily confused when they have the same name.
Yeah, and it's not like you were using a computerized system whereby you can scan in barcode. These back then it was a case you write it down, you submit the forms in triplicate, and with your carbon copy getting passed around. And
then some signalman possibly has to tap it out in Morse code, and they will make it as brief as possible because the little hands are going bip 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 bip. And then it will take weeks or months for something to come out of a factory, go on a boat, and actually find its way to where your unit is. And if it's the wrong thing, it's not good.
Now, let's talk about the actual uses of the M3 in combat.
Ooh, okay.
Now, so it was first shipped over. The British first needed it in North Africa. They were desperate for tanks, having lost a lot of their tanks at Dunkirk.
They were desperate for anything that wasn't a Crusader. As we've discussed, Valentine, you taking on Panzer IIIs and moving into Panzer IVs with the 2-pounder cannon was not fun.
Well, they could do those. The problem was it was the 88s and the Pak 39
getting hit by them.
Yeah, and Pak 39s, the anti-tank weapons that they couldn't hit with an anti-tank round.
Yes,
they didn't have the capability.
They needed the high explosive round.
They needed an HE round that they could do something with.
Yep.
Which made them very vulnerable. And so as soon as the Grants have turned up in North Africa, suddenly they've got a force multiplier in their tank capabilities, in which they hadn't had previously, and it was of great benefit to them.
But my point is that some British tanks, in particular Valentine and Matilda, had some merit. In that they were extremely tough. They were certainly, the Valentine was extremely reliable.
Well, more reliable than most other British tanks. Which would, as David Fletcher would say, would just break down for the fun of it.
Yeah, but Valentine had a proven record of being able to drive some of them driving 8,000 kilometres without a service. Valentines were extremely reliable. They were just incredibly cramped and didn't have much in the way of weaponry. But on the other hand, they could also tow anti-tank guns and the crews right on top of them. They were quite versatile. But the Crusader in particular was just a terrible tank that couldn't do very much. And compared to that, you get into the M3, and it's a Cadillac of tanks by what they were used to.
Yeah, so just remember the tanks they were taking on from the German and the Italians had limited armour, only at most 50 mils. And most of them were toting around 50 mil guns. There were some short barrel 75s being mounted on the Panzer IVs by this stage, but still, even that is nothing compared to the proper 75s that are mounted on the M3 Lees.
Yeah, we're still in essentially early war tank designs where it was either a short barreled wide bore cannon lobbing high explosive, or it was quite a small weapon firing a high velocity round to penetrate armour, and then. Obviously you had the arms race leading up to things like the IS-2 at the end of the war, where you've got absolutely enormous, very long cannons on your tanks.
But at this stage, from 42 and 43, you have you aren't seeing the Tigers yet. You're still only seeing the Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs, and even the Panzer IIIs being, I think it's the J version with the 50 mil high velocity gun on it. And the Panzer IVs have got the short barrel 75s.
Yeah, even the Panzer IIIs and IVs aren't what they will be later in the war.
No,
in terms of
they have a lot of capability for upgrades, and one day we'll get into those sort of things. But not today. We've got to save something for later.
Look, we've been saving the Panzer series for a special treat. Yes, and we probably will get to them. I think
some stage,
sometime this year.
Yeah, at least one of them.
Yeah. No more than one this year.
No.
I think I would also just mention, because everyone's says rude things about the Italians in North Africa and in World War II in general, and mostly that was the Germans making excuses for their own failures, and partly propaganda for just to discourage the Italians. But in these campaign battles, we're talking about the Centauro and the Ariete divisions of the Italian army were the absolute
Bersaglieri.
Yeah, were the absolute backbone of Rommel's armies, and fought extremely hard and extremely well, and showed that if you ever doubted it, that Italians are entirely capable when well led and
well led and well supplied.
Yeah.
And which is what they hadn't
Rommel's army is well supplied, so a grey area.
They had the rounds, they had the ammunition and the petrol for carrying out certain operations. It was control operations.
Yeah, and
they would have liked more.
They told what to do. They knew how to do it. They went out and did it.
They had good leadership, and they were. So let's get on to that. So first off, I think we'll start off the Battle of Gazala.
Right.
So this is where the British first using the grants against the Rommel and the Afrika Korps.
Now, Gazala is often thought of as Rommel's best battle.
Yes, where he took the British, having basically set up a good defensive line, had him. He's attacked. He's cut through their southern part of their line. And then the attack is stalled. They have him basically bottled up in Gazala, in the cauldron as it's called, and they've got him outnumbered, they've got him surrounded, and they're just waiting, and they're just saying, okay, we've got 200 grants that have been just delivered, and then they attack piecemeal. And every time a brigade or battalion of tanks goes in, it gets seen off by Rommel and his.
They did keep driving into the 88s.
Yep.
Which we've often discussed how it's not actually great when your divisional anti-aircraft is having to do double duty as an anti-tank weapon. That does indicate there have been some failures in your system. But when the enemy keeps driving up the road and your big divisional anti-aircraft guns can keep pounding them, then why not?
And look, did not go well for the British at this stage, because they did penny packet their tank attacks. They didn't go in as a divisional tank assault, and Rommel was able to defeat them in detail by concentrating his armour, and he was on the defensive as they were attacking him in his encircled position. all the time that the Italians cleared out the minefields that were keeping him locked in and are able to resupply him.
Now let's just for the date, this is important because this is May through June 1942, and a scale of the losses, because the British are quite good at glossing over the ones they lose. It's like if you listen to any of their histories of the 100 Years' War, it's all like Agincourt and Crecy, and they don't. Castellon somehow doesn't come up, or the fact they'd lost the war. But
yes, the UK monarchy is not the monarchy of France. No.
Yes, but I'll note the German casualties in this battle German and Italian casualties were around 6,000. The British casualties were 50,000, and they lost Tobruk, and it's quite funny because they were like, oh, well, we didn't really care about Tobruk anyway. A few months earlier, they'd cared about Tobruk.
Yeah,
they'd held that siege for months and months.
Okay, to be fair, they had made the decision to we don't need to hold Tobruk anymore. That was not a strategic concern for them after the first siege, and so they'd removed a lot of the defences and the artillery and the people guarding it and the troops that are based there. So it was much more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. It was only after Gazala, Winston Churchill has written to Auchinleck, who was the Auchinleck, who's the commander in charge, the British commander in charge of the area, saying, "And I presume we're not going to let Tobruk go."
And Auchinleck's like,
well, that wasn't the plan. So I guess the poor South Africans and Indians who were there are going to have to stay there and fight to the last. And so they lost. I mean, because essentially they lost because Winston Churchill had gotten involved with military decisions that it was not his role to do.
Or if he was to want Tobruk held at all costs, he should have informed his field commanders earlier.
6 months earlier, when they made the decision to not hold it at all costs anymore.
Now, while we're talking about Tobruk, it's worth mentioning that about 15 minutes on a bicycle from where we're sitting, the Tobruk Memorial on Anzac Parade features the shape of the memorial is actually in the shape of the defensive trenches at Tobruk. And
is that on Anzac Parade? I thought that was on the highway.
That's on Anzac Parade.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's a slab of marble built into it, which we stole from the Tobruk post office. It was one of the steps of the Tobruk post office, which must have been very grand with these marble steps. And
it's an old town, but
Anyway, it's if any of our listeners are visiting Canberra, a walk up and down Anzac Parade and looking at the memorials is, I think anyone who's enjoying this podcast will thoroughly enjoy that little bit of history.
Other things. So, of the 200 grants that were taken into Gazala, the British lost 115, plus another 600 of other tanks.
Well, in total, nearly 1,200 armoured vehicles damaged or destroyed.
So the Germans and
that's a lot. That is a huge. That's a big bunch of losses.
Yep.
I mean, the Germans lost nearly 500 tanks, over 500 tanks.
I think I'm listed as 200, mainly Panzer IIIs, and the Italians lost 160.
Yeah, I was once you bring those together. Yeah.
All right. And the main thing with their losses is that because they held the battlefield, they were able to recover them and repair a lot of those.
Yeah. No, Gazala was a miserable failure, which, as I say,
and then destroyed morale in North Africa for the UK forces.
The retreating UK forces. I've read accounts of folks in Alexandria thought the Germans were going to be there any second. People were jumping onto ships and fleeing as fast as they could, drinking all the booze in the bars. It was absolutely chaotic scenes.
Put it on my tab. I'll pay it next week.
Yeah, and Claude Auchinleck and Neil Ritchie, the British commanders, deserve a great deal of the blame for the disaster at Gazala. To some extent, the M3's failings, and against a gunner behind an 88, an M3 was just too big and easy a target.
Yes. And look, but they improved their tactics. So that was the first use of them. Rommel had a lot of respect for the M3s and said they couldn't. They were very highly defended against his tanks, and their HE rounds could take out all these anti-tank weapons in the open. So
in Gazala in particular, the German 88s were very well concealed, and the British just didn't know what was shooting at them or where it was coming from, and that is a recipe for slaughter.
So from there, the Grants were as the Rommel started his retreat back across North Africa. The the Grants were very effective as part of that advance. But then we're going to come across to the other side of North Africa and the Kasserine Pass.
It's funny because we're talking about, certainly if you're going to talk about the Allies in terms of being the British and the Americans, let's leave the Russians out of it for now. Gazala and Kasserine are just two of the most god-awful, screwed up wastes of life that the Allies managed.
And if Rommel had more petrol, who knows what,
Yeah. I mean, at Gazala, apparently they found 18,000 litres of petrol they didn't know they had, which gave Rommel a lot more operational space than he was planning for.
Yeah, because his supply lines from Italy had been cut quite significantly. And even though he increased his numbers of tanks on the ground, his petrol supplies being delivered from Europe had been cut quite a lot. So there was all a very much a dance of, do we keep pushing through in North Africa and try and take Egypt? Or he was told you're only allowed to go as far as Tobruk. Because they didn't have the support to be able to go any further than that.
Yeah, I mean, Tobruk is a port zone theory where if you've got Tobruk, you can
they
supply further.
But because he was allowed to do that, they delayed the operation to try and take out Malta, which was the main attacking point used by the British to stop the shipping and so through into Tripoli. So
the siege of Malta sadly involves no tanks, so
we won't get to that. But the point is, for strategically wise, it's from the Germans' point of view, is that if they had stopped, if they told Rommel, no, you can't advance, we're going to use whatever forces and resources we can to take Malta, so that you can then attack next year, then they probably would have been better off than letting him go. And not taking Malta, which provided an ability for the Allies to stop his supply routes.
Yeah, the question is whether they would have succeeded in taking Malta, which
yes,
that was a very tough nut.
That would have weighed upon a lot of people of saying, well, the Ottomans never, the Caliphate never managed it, and how many...
Yeah, I mean, some of the operations to resupply Malta, in particular, Operation Pedestal, were just colossal conflicts of naval and air forces around what is a very small island. But, I mean, this is also, it's still being litigated in Britain today very ferociously that the descendants of the army forces who fought in North Africa are still blaming the Royal Air Force for not engaging tactically with the German forces, and the descendants of the Air Force pilots are saying we were bombing the fuel dumps. So and that was what killed off Rommel's advances, was the fact we kept starving him of fuel. And still to this day, the children and grandchildren of the tank crews are saying we really wanted you to bomb the tank that was right in front of Grandad. But in the letter pages of on the blogs, they're still fighting this in a quite savage way. And I think, given we look at this, and the thing that kept strangling Rommel was his lack of fuel. Much as it pains me to support the Air Force, incredibly painful to support the Air Force. They were probably right. But it's still, at that moment when you've got a tank in front of you and no way to combat it, and you're watching your planes flying overhead not doing anything about it, that would be very annoying. I can see that.
All right, so we're going to get to the Americans enter North Africa in November of 1942.
Yes, let's go back to Kasserine Pass, the next great cock-up.
So they've entered the war. They've landed in North Africa in November of 1942. They've advanced a little bit out of the three cities, Iran, Algiers, and Casablanca. But then the rains have come and have slowed them down. There's been a bit of trouble with the Free French until they got convinced. Sorry, not the Free French, the Vichy French, until they got convinced to surrender. And then you've got the Africa Corps and Rommel and everybody else. All the Axis forces have been forced up into a little corner of around Tunis, and the British forces from the east have come across, slowly coming across. The American and British forces from the west have bottled them up through the Atlas Mountains. And then there are a couple of, and then the Germans have set up a cordon on the passes through the Atlas Mountains into around Tunis and another town, Biglisi. I'm probably saying that wrong, and I totally am saying it wrong. But anyway, which brings us to the Kasserine Pass. February 1943, the U.S. 1st Armored Division.
Under Lloyd Friedenthal.
With
Sorry,
M3,
Friedendahl.
Yeah, with M3 Lees, because they had Shermans. They had to give those up for the British to take their Shermans, and so they went back to their M3 Lees. Some of the force had M3s. Saw Germans at the front of them and said, "Right, we can do this." Went charging off to the German positions. And as soon as they got there, they started blowing stuff up, and the Germans were all running away. I said, "Oh, you beauty, let's chase after them." They chased after them and right into the guns of the 88s. And everything went bad. Now, the annoying thing is
another ambush by the divisional anti-air, which, considering this, it happened in France, and it just kept happening.
There was a lot of inexperience in the American forces, and that was...
It happened to the British so many times, like, you can hardly blame the Americans.
No, but they're trying to say... What they're saying is that you really should have... The British really should have told them, don't do this. And that information should have been passed along. I strongly
suspect the British did say, don't do that, and certain people said, what do they know?
Yeah, and there was a lot of complaints about how the Americans would only dig... shell scrapes rather than foxholes, proper foxholes. So shell scrapes about 18 inches deep.
It's worth noting, Kasserine is February 1943, so about 6 months after Gazala.
Yep.
And, 3,000 American prisoners of war taken.
Well, that wasn't. So that was the main. That was the prelude to the actual attack on Kasserine Pass, which is where the Italians and so forth come in. But that U.S. First Armored attack was a real prelude. Was a real shock to America. They didn't take the prisoners there. They took it on the next day when the Italians went through with the Centauro Division in the 7th Bersaglieri and the 5th Bersaglieri and so forth, basically led the way through and took out the American forces, the thin American forces that were holding this mile-wide pass. They've smashed through there over a day, and then the 10th Panzer group or some sort of division have then come through and then smashed around the Americans. That's where they've taken all the prisoners.
Yes, but in terms of the battle as a whole, the shock to the American system of having to inform 3,000 families that their loved ones are now
missing, presumed captured or dead.
But prisoners of Nazi Germany, which I never liked being that fair to Nazis, but Nazi treatment of non-Jewish prisoners of war was roughly within bounds of the laws of war. There were worse things. There were many, many worse things that could happen.
Could be caught by the Japanese.
Yeah, in World War II. But I would imagine, because it's literally the first engagement of the war, it would have been quite a shock.
Yeah, there had been other engagements. The Chuigi Pass in November of 42 was just after the landing in North Africa. It was the first US tank on Nazi tank fight.
That was Henry Cabot, the congressman.
It could be, but this was they were M3s, but they were M3 lights that was fighting these ones. So the 60, he had a battalion of 60 M3 lights.
Okay, the Cabot one was in the mediums, but okay.
And that was against Panzer 3s and 4s and also Italians, and basically he snuck up behind them and shot them in the back, which is a really good thing to be doing. So that was Kasserine Pass. The Allies once again, if Rommel had been allowed to attack further and been given more support and supplies, those forces, the Allied forces around there, which vastly outnumbered the Axis forces, would have been in a lot of trouble because he would have gotten into their rear areas and done horrible things. But he got told by his boss to say, nope, we've got to consolidate first, and then that gave the Allies a chance to regroup and counterattack and basically start pushing back on Tunis.
Yeah, I mean, it's, Friedendahl is widely reviled for his leadership at Kasserine and was immediately put on a boat back home. And that sort of led to the rise of George Patton. I mean, literally in the Patton movie, opens with the carnage at Kasserine and Patton sort of arriving to express his disgust at the performance of All and Sundry and that he's going to do things better. Which, I mean, that movie is
propaganda.
It's largely fantasy.
It's propaganda.
But, having said that, I don't think anyone's going to question that Patton was a good general. He probably wasn't. I mean, literally, the Germans did not fear him the way American propaganda tried to make it out. But it's completely true that they, for the D-Day landings, they had Patton sitting in a fake headquarters, sending fake orders to make the Germans think that the main thrust was coming from a different place. Patton must have really hated.
He really pissed somebody off to make that happen.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're going to pause there and come back with
Beer review.
This ain't no grog or ale. 1 pint down, you'll be swinging in the gale. 5 pints, bully, you'll be shaking in your shoes.
Okay, Rob, what do we got here?
We have Budweiser, King of Beers. Not Budvar, Budweiser.
Not the good one, no. Still the flagship beer of AB InBev, the world's biggest maker of beer.
Anheuser-Busch. They have, you would have been to some of their amusement parks.
Busch Gardens
is
one of my happiest memories of my childhood, absolutely.
You bet. Just outside of Baltimore.
So Budweiser is literally a pale approximation of really good Czech beers. Literally markets itself, I think, still as a Bohemian lager or Bohemian Pilsner. It is
the world-renowned Budweiser lager beer. It says Australia, Africa, America, Asia, Europe.
Yeah, they have sold it in all those places.
This is the famous Budweiser beer. We know of no brand produced by any other brewer which costs so much to brew and age. Our exclusive Beechwood aging product produces a taste, a smoothness, and a drinkability you will find in no other beer at any price. Brewed by our original process from the choicest hops, rice, and best barley malt.
Yeah, but literally on the label, the front of the label, it's saying it is the choicest hops, rice, and best barley. And rice is not a famously great ingredient to be putting in beer. Now, plenty of beers do use rice. If you're going to go on the German purity laws, which I do think are overrated, it's literally not supposed to be in beer. Certainly the Japanese do a lot of fun stuff with rice in their beers, but mostly it's used as a really cheap adjunct and source of carbohydrate, which the yeast can convert. And, I mean, what we've got here, let's just break it down like we would if this was a beer we'd never had before. It's an extremely pale, even for lager, beer. It does have a very nice tight white head. Like, there's no question. I mean,
lots of bubbles.
AB InBev hire the best brewers in the world. Yes, they work in enormous factories dealing with vats, of huge, colossal vats. But
Ian's got something to say about this as
well. Look, yes, okay, thank you, Ian. It is crisp. It is clear. If this was some little craft brewery making it, you'd actually say, yeah, this beer's pretty good. It's all right. On a hot summer's day, it's fine. It's just, I mean, it's in no way deserving of it doesn't even have a good...
Self-proclaimed accolades?
Self-proclaimed accolades, yeah. I mean, if someone bought a case of this to a party, you just wouldn't blink.
No.
Well, in this country, you'd be like, why did you get that? Because it's not that available. But, fundamentally, it is a lager. It is light. It is easy to drink. I would say it's even less of a hot profile in this than the mainstream Australian domestic lagers, and that's saying something. There's just very little going on, which makes it accessible, easy to drink, nice on a hot summer's day, but fundamentally, it's not very interesting. Which makes it almost nothing like the M3 Medium.
I was going for the idea of mediocre beers, so which is why it's American. 4.5% and only 330 mils, so it's a 1.2 standard drinks.
Yeah, so this is not Bud Light, which is what most of the Budweiser served in America is, as far as I understand.
Now, Bud Light being a light beer, as in light alcohol, or light calories?
Light alcohol.
All right.
Although alcohol is calories.
Yes.
So, yeah. Look, I mean, we've drunk the 6-pack you bought, Rob.
Yes, we are.
It's not bad. I don't feel any unpleasant effects.
No, tastes fine.
Tastes fine, but it's in no way memorable. I'm not going to wake up tomorrow or next year and say, "Oh, do you remember that time we had that?" Which there have been some beers that we've done in this podcast with
Sinha, the Sri Lankan chocolate stout in another life. It was very memorable.
Yes, sorry, I was just letting the dog out of the room. Good work on the filler there, Rob. Okay, so that is Budweiser. We still have much to talk about with the M3.
Because while it was very quickly replaced by the M4 Shermans in North Africa and all the UK and American forces got rid of them and said, you know what, we don't need these anymore.
Well, they just said, we want the main gun to be able to point where the enemy are. it's not asking too much.
It's asking a lot, all right? So...
That's really the only thing... Well, I mean, the gun in the M4 Sherman...
Plenty of tank destroyers did not have turrets.
Yeah, but, the tank destroyer concept is something we could probably devote a whole episode to.
Now, we should talk about the actual... speaking of tank destroyers, we should talk about how the rounds for the 75mm rounds for the 75mm gun weren't very good at tank destroying, and it was only by taking the fuses, or was the warheads from German 75mm rounds, and then basically screwing them onto the canisters of the American rounds, that they actually got an effective anti-tank round out of the 75s.
Okay, so there's a few things that went on there. One was the classic thing that happened to a lot of American weapons, I'm thinking particularly of their torpedoes, in that the fuse got tested in a very limited set of circumstances and worked just fine in those limited circumstances. And then when they started using them at particularly firing at shorter ranges and shallower angles, that the fuses weren't exploding when they were striking the ground at those shallow angles. And so from the fusing, they did a lot of replacing with different fuses to get something that would actually go boom when it was fired over shorter distances. Because fundamentally, if your 75mm high explosive isn't going boom, what is the point of this enormous iron cathedral with 7 men on the battlefield? And also taking up an aircraft engine that could have been flying a plane. But you also had the lack of a 75mm armor-piercing round, and because the 37mm was really starting to not cut it in a anti-tank role.
Yeah, as the armours on various German tanks
started getting up-armoured,
and you started running into Tigers and up-armoured Panzer IVs.
Yeah, I mean, Tigers, Jesus, are actually starting to be on the battlefield at this point. And apparently, one of the things they did was that at one of the points when they'd captured Tobruk, Tobruk was captured many times, they captured 20,000 German 75mm anti-tank rounds, and they figured out that they could, with some fiddling on the driving bands, actually get these to fire out of the M3's cannon. Now, I can only imagine this was done with bits of string and people standing very safe distances away from the tank.
Okay, if you've met any of the Ordnance Corps explosive types folks, you know they just love blowing things up and playing with explosives. Right?
I'm sure on a quiet day when no one had to advance, they were thoroughly enjoying trying to fire different bits of ammunition out of one of these.
Now, I'm just going to throw in a call out. So the British TV show Bluestone 4-2.
Yes.
Very funny.
Excellent show.
Very seasons 2 and 3 now available on Amazon Prime. Yeah, I didn't know that. I found that the other day. I thought,
wow, that's a binge coming up tonight. Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately they don't have the Christmas episode, and you can't get season 1. I'm trying to source.
Season 1 I've watched 1,000,000 times.
I'm trying to source the Christmas episode though.
So sorry for folks who aren't aware of it. Bluestone 4-2 is, I believe, still the only. It's basically, you could describe it as roughly analogous to MASH, but set in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And is about a British bomb disposal team.
Bomb disposal team.
Being
their call sign
is Bluestone 4-2.
Yeah.
And driving around and dealing with things and
IEDs and unexploded.
For a depiction of real soldiers in a real war zone, it feels very real. It's also hilariously funny. It's written as a comedy, but
it is very much a comedy.
Anyone who's met real soldiers who've been in real war zones will recognise things they've seen. And the
British officer class is depicted very well, to my mind.
As
in accurately.
Not entirely flattering, but
yes. But that's the whole point. They're not entirely flattering.
Okay, so Bluestone. Yes. Okay. Moving back from that to the tanks. They did actually figure out an anti-tank round, and then the anti-tank rounds were actually produced properly for it. There is an issue with you can make it go boom once without exploding and killing everyone on board, but how many times can you do that before something fractures under stress and mixing ammunition
blows up in your barrel?
Yeah. Blows up in your whole tank. It's mixing ammunition types and using ammunition that is not designed for the weapon you're using is extremely high risk. But if you don't have an anti-tank round for the 75 and you've got tanks to fight, then you sometimes take chances. It seemed to work in that case. And I would say it's partly because American industry can be slow and weird in what weapons it turns out, but
once it's geared
they
up
tend to
and
be pretty
switched
well
on,
made.
and once it's switched on and geared up, they produce a lot of them.
A lot of them, yeah, but there's also a solidness to the construction. Certainly, well, even today, I mean, that's the difference between American weapons being used in Ukraine and Russian weapons is that the American ones have been designed to work every time. Now let's talk. Yeah.
I was going to say, let's move to, so they've been, M3s have been replaced by the M4s in North Africa. The places they are still being used is Russia. Now, the Russians aren't using them as frontline tanks, but like the the Valentine, they are using them as second-line tanks. And so they are going through and cleaning up the areas where your T-34s are not. And being used effectively there. Yeah. However, as you say, the Russians didn't like them because they would catch on fire and kill 7 people.
Yeah, I mean, so literally the name that we're putting on this episode, the Coffin for 7 Brothers, is what the Russians thought of this thing. I find it interesting they had such a dim view of it, given amongst other things, this was the only, I believe, one of the very first tanks that actually had a heater for the crew compartment. It had an auxiliary power unit, which was also very useful because you could start the auxiliary power unit like a lawnmower with a piece of rope, and it was a little one-cylinder engine. But once you got that going, you could use that to heat the engine, which is very important in the Russian winter, and then use that to start the main engine.
And get your oil flowing around.
Apparently, thanks to the chieftain, it also featured a hand crank. You didn't use that to start the engine. You used the hand crank just to get the oil moving from the bottom of the cylinders that are at the bottom of the radial engine tend to be where the oil ends up. And if you run the hand crank a few times, you get the oil circulated through the engine. And then your auxiliary power unit can start it up. But the auxiliary power units, are quite advanced and sophisticated. We think of them as modern tanks, but the M3 had one all the way back in 1942. The problem the Russians had, I think, was just that the landscape, well, it's not that different from the desert, frankly, of the Russian steppe meant that such a tall tank made it especially vulnerable. And they lost them in phenomenal numbers. They were heavily engaged at Stalingrad and lost in very large numbers. They were heavily engaged at Kursk and lost in very large numbers.
Just remember, they're also facing a lot more tanks than the British and Americans were in North Africa.
Yeah.
And these were the upgunned Panzer IVs, and at this stage, Panthers and Tigers as well. So
in North Africa, an M3 on at least one occasion, an M3 took 30 rounds. It had like only three of those caused what they call major damage, but the tank stayed in the fight, so it wasn't catastrophic damage. Whereas the weapons on the German tanks by this point, the big long barreled 75s and the 88s were getting to be way too much for this weird high-sided riveted,
which you can hit from a long way away.
Yeah,
and can't be held down.
Yeah, So the Russians did not like it, but it fought a lot. Now, one thing I wish I could find out more about was that they used them particularly in the Finnish sectors, where they were fighting French tanks that the Germans had captured in the fall of France and shipped to the Finns.
Yep.
They definitely fought Somoise. There is a possibility, though, that the M3s might have fought Shah B1s. At which point, the two tanks
with
hull-mounted Sponson guns,
hull-mounted 75s,
could have actually been fighting each other. I have no evidence of that. It's merely an entertaining possibility. Yes. So Russians didn't like them, got stuck with them. I still think, as long as you're in a second line area, being the only tank with a heater in it would have made you very popular for about 3/4 of the year in Russia.
Yeah. And then we're going to move to the other theatre, which was
the Pacific.
The Pacific. Well, in this case, it wasn't actually Pacific. We were actually looking in Burma.
Mm.
Battle of Admin Box.
I just love the name of this battle.
Basically, as the Japanese had advanced through Burma, the first time they advanced through Burma in 1942, they were smashed through the British and Indian troops stationed there because the Japanese troops were very experienced at jungle warfare, and the British and Indian troops were not, and they got their hats handed to them. Then the Japanese decided it was a bit hard and a bit difficult to keep going, so they did not advance into India when they had the opportunity in 1943, and basically they took the year off. And then in 1944, both sides decided they were going to continue the conflict. So the Japanese decided to start advancing again into India, and the British and Indian forces decided they were going to start counterattacking into Burma.
I think let's just briefly touch on when we talk about Indian forces.
You have the Indian National Forces fighting for the Japanese.
Yeah, and there is actually an Amazon show, The Forgotten Army, on that.
And then there's the British Indian forces who are fighting for the Allies.
And it was one of the biggest armies in the world, even in World War II, where there were a lot of big armies going around. and it's little regarded the enormous amount of fighting the Indian Army did against the Japanese, particularly in Burma. And it was mostly, Indian troops with British officers, which is an increasingly ugly look. And, of course, large sections of India were subjected to famine because Churchill... this is a very controversial topic and certainly did not pay attention to the famine and the grain supply. And there's the counter-argument that actually they made enormous efforts, but, wars are hard. Anyway, a lot of Indians died. Millions of Indians died in this war, and it's probably deserves more attention than it gets. Let's leave it at that. But the Indian Army fielded certainly hundreds of M3s, and against Japanese. The 37mm on the top turret was just fine for plinking them.
And one of the aspects that gets overlooked is that height in a jungle environment is
actually a problem.
Is not only less of a problem; it's actually an advantage because you have visibility over the undergrowth that nobody else does, and so being 10 foot high up, you can see over the low level canopy,
which is literally why Indians used elephants in war for
exactly
a very
right.
long time.
Yep.
Just to get their heads up. Yep.
So it was actually a very effective tank. So yes, the Japanese had very limited anti-tank and armor in the environment. They actually made the calculation that the Allies wouldn't be able to get tanks into certain areas, but the M3 Lee was Lees and Grants, and so while the British were supposed to have had Grants,
definitely a lot of Lees.
I'm
literally looking at a picture of a Lee in Burma.
Yeah, exactly right. And so yes, there were a combination, and it was just let's just call them. So they did manage to get through the environment there, which is surprising. It shows the reliability of the tank and the manoeuvrability of it.
Particularly, they had quite narrow tracks, which can be problematic in snowy and muddy environments. There'd been a decision made, which sounded okay at the time, that the weight of thicker tracks was more of a liability. But, pretty much as everyone discovered throughout World War II, wider tracks were worth the wait. Anyway, it still proved itself more mobile when used creatively in the jungle than people thought they would be.
Yeah, and for the first time, so basically the Japanese had done what they had done successfully so many times. They infiltrated through the lines of the British and Indian defences and then encircled a position and had... Once they'd done that, they usually were able to starve out and just overrun any encircled position that they had done. And this had worked for them for however long, and they've been very successful. And the Battle of Admin Box, which is in February of 1944, basically they've gone through the frontline units of the Allied forces and come across their rear areas, headquarters, signallers and other sundry units, plus there are a couple of tanks there. And having encircled that, they thought they were going to take this rear area with all the ammunition, supplies and everything else that the Japanese had said, we can't supply our own troops, so we're going to send them into the field with 3 weeks worth of supplies and then let them capture the enemy supplies and live off that. And that's what they've done. And it has worked for them so many times. But for once, the Allies had the M3 tanks there, and they could not overrun this rear area location that wasn't frontline troops. It wasn't your divisions of infantry. It was your divisional headquarters, your signallers and supply troops, not your frontline fighters. But they managed to hold out through the help of these Indian Army tanks, and the Allies were also able to supply the location from airdrops. And this was, again, something that the Japanese hadn't taken into account, is that whereas normally they would just starve out the enemy, they were getting resupplied by air, and they had the tanks to counter any sort of attacks that came through into the base. And this was the first time their process of infiltration and encirclement hadn't worked. And that then went on to the Battle of Imphal, which was much...
Imphal, I think.
Imphal?
But, yep. I would just to go back a second. I do want to give some credit to General Slim, the who really changed things for the British when he arrived in theatre. He's famous for a lot of sayings, such as the British Army only ever fights where four maps meet. Uphill where four maps meet.
And they're all different scales. Just remember that. There's not the same scale maps. I've had this situation happen to me. I've got one map of one scale, another map of another scale, and then putting them together in a corner.
Yep. And another one of Slim's sayings, particularly because up until this point, the Japanese had kept attacking in the rear all through the Singapore campaign. And every time they got attacked in the rear, the British forces would panic and run away. And one of Slim's doctrines was that if the enemy's attacking you in the rear, you've got him outflanked. And for having that flexibility of thought for the battle space instead of we have a line and we must hold it, was quite revolutionary for getting the British Indian forces to not be defeated by the Japanese. And part of that was his use of air power and air supply.
Which he wasn't allowed to have, but he just took it anyway. And the commanders, those planes were supposed to be doing runs to support Chiang Kai-shek in China. But he said, look, come on, guys.
I need them right now, right here.
And the air commanders on the ground said, oh, okay, we'll do you a favour. Yeah. And that's how he was able to... so he didn't actually have the authority to do these airdrops, but they made them happen.
There is a strong school of thought that Slim was actually the best British general of World War II, although obviously Montgomery gets a strong mention. There is a William Slim Drive here in Canberra named after him. But,
different theatres, different requirements.
They were both extremely successful, and compared to
Monty might have been better at tank commands and so forth, and he was more because it's much more Burma and India are much more infantry based.
Yeah,
and logistics based of people, using people for your logistics rather than trucks or anything else.
Yeah, I would say, both of them commanded M3s, so they're well within the scope of this podcast. Compared to the previous generations of commanders who had allowed the Japanese and the Germans to get inside their heads and defeat them, both Montgomery and Slim just didn't let that happen to themselves because they were smarter and better, and they were basically the generals that changed the tide and course of the war where their troops were involved. And it's obviously there's always an enormous number of factors in these things, but when you've got a clear pattern of letting yourself get beaten to a clear pattern of not letting yourself get beaten, you've got to give some credit where that's happened.
All right, so the Battle of Impal and the corresponding Battle of Kohima were from March to July 1944, and again, it was the turning point of the Burma campaign. The Japanese did have 66 various tanks available for this attack. However, they were no match for the M3 Lees and Grants that were deployed by the Indian Army in the environment. The first, leading up to the Battle of Impal, there were six M3s took on 6 Type 95 Hargos, and all the Japanese tanks got destroyed. And basically, as the battles went on, the M3 Lees showed themselves to be far superior and were a deciding factor in any sort of attacks.
So I would say that wasn't due to any great qualities of the tanks, rather than they were simply much better than the Japanese ones. And there are some really interesting accounts of the Japanese pulling off extremely well executed ambushes, where they in particular made sure that they were ambushing from the side where the M3's gun couldn't traverse.
And suicide bombers, they would have guys.
Yeah, that came later.
So the kamikaze troops the kamikaze pilots basically had their ground force equivalents who would have large boxes of TNT strapped to the chest and then run out of the jungle and blow themselves up against the side of the tank.
Yeah, or hide in culverts, apparently using a hammer to detonate the explosives. It's been described, and that's one of the ones that annoys me. It's like, you could have figured out a remote detonation that wouldn't have lost you one of your most dedicated soldiers. Yeah. There's the thing that annoys me is the waste. When you have people who are willing to give up their lives for your cause, they're better utilised in ways that don't give up their lives. It's Patton's line. The aim is not to die for your country. It's make to the other bastards die for theirs. Yeah.
All right. There is still an M3 Grant in Kohima, which is within India, Nagaland.
Ooh, okay. Yep.
And is there...
Nagaland is quite an active guerrilla war still going on, which no one pays any attention to.
It was abandoned by the Allied forces in their first attacks on Kohima, where an Indian brigade held out for 6 days against the Japanese forces and allowed...
I think Kohima, they were fighting over a tennis court with, nearly divisional sized units.
No, that was Imphal.
That was Imphal, okay.
And that was that's when a Lee came crashing down from the hill above that nobody thought they could get a tank onto, came crashing down onto the tennis court and smashed up the Japanese bunkers. But no, there is still a M3 Grant in Kohima as a war memorial to the... it was left where it was when it was abandoned after the first attacks, and then that 6 days that the Indian brigade held out gave the Allies time to regroup and reinforce everywhere else, and held them up, and so they did a very good job. And it was basically as a very dedicated memorial to
the Kohima epitaph. For your tomorrows, they gave their todays.
But we're going to take a quick break here and come back and talk about what happened after the war.
Oh no, Rob, we've still got
the
Australian 1st Armoured Division.
Oh yeah, well that's what I'm talking about. It's happening after.
Well, no, anyway.
We'll come back. The Australian actions.
Look, folks, you're getting a long one. So you all told us how much you enjoyed the enormous episode last time, and here you go. You're getting another one. So now our thoughts turn to the
closer to home,
and it's something that Rob is quite a subject matter expert on the Australian Army, having served in it, and I'm a moderate subject matter expert, having worked at the Australian War Memorial, but almost no one knows about the Australian 1st Armoured Division, which was actually a thing. Was formed and stood up in 1941 with a view to sending a full armoured division to North Africa, and then the Japanese invaded, and
we said we're not sending troops to that environment when they're bombing Darwin right now.
Yeah, and the Australian 9th Infantry Division, very famously had actually been formed in the UK out of Australians living in the UK, and went on to become one of the most successful units of the Second World War, and certainly one of the finest infantry units. But it had an enormous amount of British supplied armour and other vehicles, and when the Australian government recalled it to Australia in fear of Japanese invasion, the British said, about their equipment.
Yeah,
that's ours.
We're going to hang on to that and give it to the Indians and South Africans who are replacing you.
and that created a very weird situation where one of the finest mechanised infantry units in the world had to be retrained as jungle fighters, which you could argue in the bigger scheme of the Allied war effort was not the best thing we could have done.
No.
But
especially if we sent them to Singapore just before it fell.
Well, the 9th didn't have that, but that was the 8th.
Sorry, that was the 8th.
The inglorious 8th. But we also had, as we've discussed a few times, touching on the Sentinel, the Australian designed and built tanker, which we built about 90, but none of them were ever actually accepted to service because, if the Japanese had actually invaded...
We'll get to this.
Yeah, we'll get to... If the Japanese had actually invaded, they probably would have been useful against Japanese armour, but they were very much a desperate panic because the country said, we need tanks, and no one in the world was selling tanks in 1941. They all needed any tanks they had. And then the British said, you know what, these M3s are rubbish, we're getting M4s, we don't need them. And Australia, being the muggins it always is, said, tanks, we'll have 1,000 of them. Which, as I noted earlier, did turn up with tank transporters, which were the most powerful trucks in the country and very useful for lots of other things, but certainly rumbling slowly at 30 miles an hour across the Australian landscape with the tank on the back. has made for some very interesting pictures. Anyway, so the Australian 1st Armoured Division, also part of the Australian Armoured Corps, which was formed at this time, they started literally with a couple of light tanks and running around in universal carriers trying to pretend they were tanks for training purposes.
Tanker.
Yeah, slightly better than just riding on bicycles and shooting each other with broomsticks. But
No, that was the pilots.
Not a lot better. Yeah. Wood was not sent to North Africa because of the outbreak of hostilities, and then was equipped with M3 Grants, and apparently conducted a series of large exercises around Narrabri, which would have been the most exciting thing to ever happen in Narrabri. And
it's a big area of open country, and nothing like any of the environments the Australian troops were being sent to in
the South Pacific?
In the South Pacific and Eurasia.
Yeah. We also created the 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions in 1942, which were partly equipped with M3 Grants. So we at one point we had 3 armoured divisions.
Now, just remember, boys and girls, that whilst these divisions had M3 Grants, we never deployed them overseas. We went with Matildas. We went with
M4 Shermans.
M4 Shermans. We did not take the
Stuart light tanks. We were quite fond of in overseas use,
and the universal carriers. Yes,
yes, universal carriers everywhere.
But we did not take M3 Grants overseas.
No.
So that just tells you something that we like Matildas better.
So the line here says, by the middle of the war, the Australian Army had deemed the Grant to be unsuitable for combat duties overseas, and M3 units were re-equipped with the Matilda II, a much older and in many ways less capable tank, although obviously in many ways preferable, before being deployed to the New Guinea and Borneo campaigns. And then due to personnel shortages, all 3 divisions were officially disbanded during 1943 and downgraded to brigade and battalion level units.
But having said all that, Australia was the last users of the M3
as the Yaramba
artillery piece.
Yes.
Our only self-propelled gun that we've had.
Up until today.
For what? Have we got one yet?
I don't know, but we've just bought self-propelled artillery.
Yeah, but they haven't actually been delivered yet.
No.
What are we? Redback? No, is that?
Yeah, Redback.
Redback.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
again, another spider for our non-Australian listeners. The Redback is another Australian spider that will kill you. Well, it'll make you really, really sick, and they are everywhere.
Yeah.
Any woodpile that you find
hiding in barbecues.
They're around, and they'll make you really sick and can kill small children and elderly people.
I feel bad for redbacks because they've honestly never done anything bad to me.
No,
but every time I see them, I just kill them.
Yeah, same. It's the thing you do. You don't let them mass.
Yeah. Anyway, so the point is the Yaramba self-propelled artillery was based on the 25 pounder, which is a gun I do want to talk about. Apparently
it's just your general artillery piece. So it's a 25 pounder.
I mean, I remember as a kid. Now, obviously, I'm doing a tank podcast now. I had a slightly unusual upbringing, but we had these little dinky toy replicas, 25 pounders, and you pull back the breech block, and you could fire matchsticks at each other.
Yes.
Yeah. They were really good.
Yeah.
But I just think, last year I was in Hall, which is a little town, 20-minute drive from where we are. And at their local sporting field, there was an artillery piece. So I went over to read the plaque, as folks like us do, and it was a 25 pounder.
It was a common artillery piece for a lot of the. It was from the 50s on.
So common throughout all of the old British Empire. There are they're gate guards and sitting in community parks all over the place. But what struck me looking at an actual one in 2021 when I was looking at it. It's so small for such a powerful thing.
Yep.
It could fire 12 kilometers. It had a big charge. It could be supercharged for anti-tank work. Versatile but light. And I think they had something like 25 of them. A can't be in 25 because it's 25 pounder. Anyway, but in tens of them at divisional level.
And they're they're good for basically making troops pull them up and down the football field because they are man-towable.
Man-packable.
Well, not there's probably there are versions that probably are man-packable, but the versions we had to pull around the place is he's doing a relay race, towing one of these suckers behind you 100 metres up and down the football pitch.
Yeah, but the successes of the British Army in the late war period owed a lot to the 25 pounder as a quite cheap, quite light, but just powerful, usable weapon. And as we've noted, artillery is actually the lord of battle.
God, yes.
We should do a totally artillery podcast at some point. But yeah, so
stuff those, buddy. Yeah, sausages, buddy. Smugglers.
So the full shots, as we like to call them. So we took the 25 pounder, very proven, ubiquitous weapon. We mashed it into the hull of
cut the top off a M3 branch and then shoved it into, and which is essentially what other countries had done with the Canadians.
The priest and the bishop and
the sextant.
Sexton. Yeah.
Various designations. So look, while the most of the British grants were given off to the Indian Army and the Australian Army, all the American versions were that were still floating around were converted into other things, and so they weren't. If they weren't destroyed by the Germans and the Axis forces, they were then converted into recovery vehicles, mine clearing vehicles, bulldozers, self-propelled artillery pieces. The Australians even built a beach armoured recovery vehicle called the BARV because we love a good BARV.
Yeah.
So... Because dragging something up a beach is something useful to have, being able to do. But yes, they did continue their use within Europe, especially with all the after D-Day, with all the armoured forces coming in, with the Shermans running around, would have a M3 vehicle with them that would carry out some sort of other logistical activity, whether it was recovery, maintenance, or engine replacements, carrying the engines with a crane on them, pulling out broken down Shermans or German tanks, or whatever else, pulling them out of position. That's what they were there for. So they were still a very capable hull with armour that you could do a lot of stuff with, and that just carried on the idea of, well, we've got this thing, it still works. Well, I'm not going to scrap it because we still need to be able to carry out these second line activities that may not be up the front of the tip of the spear, but the only reason the tip of the spear works is because you've got the 6 foot of shaft behind it that's doing all the work.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been better. You know, I don't think anyone would argue that it was great.
It wasn't a fighting vehicle at that stage. It had been converted into something more suitable.
Yeah, but what you had, you know, and then this came out of the M2, was a extremely reliable, effective drivetrain with a good engine. And even if the rest of the design is useless, once you've got a solid engine and drivetrain, then it's going to be something that you're going to use and carry forward.
Just like the Universal Carrier.
Yeah, I mean, on a very different scale.
I was about to say, there are different scales. You need different things for different things.
Yeah.
You don't just say, okay, one size fits all. No, it's a case of, well, this will do these things, and everybody's got their own first priorities of what actual work needs to be done, whether it's supply and logistics, whether it's battlefield recovery, whether it's actually shooting the enemy.
But, you know, there was no point that this was the best tank in the world. And the fact that literally the elderly ancient Matildas were preferred in Australian service for overseas deployment to the Grant is quite the condemnation of the Grant. But it was available in numbers at a time when we didn't have any tanks. Yep. So stuff it'll do.
Yes. And that's how the British thought about it as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, when you're upgrading from Crusaders, that's a different. And all those useless cruiser tanks the British made.
Now, talking about useless things, I just want to share my experiences of for those people who some of our listeners may play World of Tanks or War Thunder.
Mhm.
Now, both of those games have the M3 in it. Now,
but not as a good tank that anyone wants.
Well, in World of Tanks, you've only got the sponson gun, so you're basically a really bad tank destroyer.
That seems like a real oversight on their part, doesn't it? I mean,
well, it's a bit complicated.
Yeah.
You only want to have they only give you one gun. They're not about realism. They're about driving tanks around and shooting stuff. So you've only got the sponson gun, which makes you a really bad tank destroyer. You're slow, you're tall, and everything else. And you have to grind through the M3 to be able to get to the M4, which is where the good tanks are. And of course, it's just that grind was very, very, very long for me. I did not play well in the M3, but War Thunder allows you to use the turret as well as...
It actually exists as a proper tank.
Yeah, it actually exists as a proper tank. So you can use either gun and be very effective because they're more realistic about how they depict their battlefields and so forth. And so it's much more effective.
I'm sure getting used to using two turrets when you're a single person would be quite a pain, but yeah.
Just choose which gun, you just click on which gun you're firing. But so just wanted to share that little thing that the...
we haven't done a World of Tanks for you on a tank in a while, so there you go. Thank you. Right, you.
And so yes, the Australians were the last using countries for
the M3. It was in the 1950s, the Uramba finally paid out.
57, we finally got rid of the Uramba. Our last, first and self-propelled piece of artillery. And Uramba being a Aboriginal tool for helping to throw spears, which I always thought was...
A woomera.
Woomera, but...
Anyway.
We
do have many hundreds of languages in this country, so...
Almost as many as Papua New Guinea, which is even smaller. But
well, most things are smaller than Australia. Okay, now we need to talk, because, it's 2022, we're doing a tank podcast about Ukraine.
Yes. This is still happening.
Yeah. Very impressively, we have our very first that I've seen now. Tasman's been in touch about there has been some reports of tank-on-tank fighting up until now. But this week, we got the news of the Ukrainian 17th Tank Brigade.
Mainly their artillery.
Yeah, it was the brigade artillery, but it was still a tank brigade. Yes. So let's talk about that. Catching a Russian battalion trying to cross a river in the Donetsk Oblast. And the photos of just...
devastation.
Just
and the Instagram post or whatever it was.
Just T-72s everywhere wrecked in this
mud.
River. Yeah.
And the Instagram post or whatever system it was of the
engineer
who said they're going to cross here. So on a foggy day, listen out for the sound of boat engines
to bring the pontoons up.
Bring the pontoons up, and when they start coming across, this is what they're going to do. And he's posted all this on the interwebs.
Twitter,
the interwebs, and
so it's on. If you want to see this, it's on the Totally Tank Facebook page. We shared the link to this.
And he's shown, look, this is what they're going to do, and this is where they're going to cross. And he's also got, I think he's taking donations for his life after the war.
Yeah, that was a little unfortunate. But, as I said, well, we're trying to flog T-shirts, so good luck to him. And
yes, they did exactly what he said they were going to do, and they put the pontoon bridge there.
If you know how to lay a pontoon bridge, you can look at a river and say that's where it's got to go. And I did think, this reminded me, if you ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which I don't actually recommend, because aside from this one specific bit, it's all just generalities that you can figure out for yourself. It mentions in the 6th century BC, the Duke of Song was fighting a major war, and the enemy started crossing a river to attack his people, and he thought it would be dishonourable to attack them while they were crossing the river. So he waited until they were fully across the river, and then they killed him, and he died. And in the 20th century, Mao was asked at one point, the enemy's crossing the river, should we attack them while they're in the middle of the crossing? And Mao's response was, "We are not the Duke of Song."
Yeah.
And in this one, they waited until the Russians were halfway across the river, which is the optimal moment to do this.
You want some on the ground so you can basically, they've got a lot of forces deployed.
Yeah, but you don't want to knock out the pontoon before they start crossing.
No.
And you definitely don't want to knock it out after they've crossed.
Yeah, no, you want some initial forces in so that you have definite things lost on the one side.
Yeah.
Now, river crossings are a big thing now.
You just can't move particularly in Ukraine, but in lots of the world without tactical bridging.
Yeah, but river crossings are actually a tactical advantage on the advance if you've got the logistics to go with them, because
you can strike unexpectedly.
The enemy isn't attacking you, so you can build up where you want your logistics to be. But as long as you've got the logistics to go with your advance, crossing the river where you choose is actually a huge advantage, because suddenly you're in a spot the enemy's not expecting. But it is a huge logistical challenge rather than a combat challenge. So, and getting everything across them, because once you're across, you can then exploit whatever environments you're in.
You do need to keep the units supplied, which means you need to maintain the crossing. Certainly, in this case, the Ukrainian 17...
And that was, with what I was talking about is advancing through France and after D-Day, that was a big advantage for the Allies, even though it took them longer to build up those logistics to do those sort of crossings onto German held areas. It was a big advantage for them because the Germans couldn't couldn't disrupt their activities.
Yeah. Anyway, in this case, the brigade artillery of the 17th Tank Brigade opened fire when the Russians were halfway across. And then there appears to be some quite hideous milling around of the Russians who were trapped on the far side of the destroyed pontoon. Where they were calling for more bridging to be brought up so they could withdraw, and then they were just mashed up, at the Ukrainians' leisure almost. I did want to give a big shout out though. The Ukrainian 17th Tank Brigade has a direct lineage to Operation Barbarossa when they became the
20th Guards.
The 20th Guards motorized rifles. And they have a lineage and a history as a unit through the Second World War. They
based in and recruited from Ukraine.
Ukraine, yes. And they escaped encirclement during Barbarossa and fought a number of major battles. Sadly for them, they had their Order of Suvorov and Red Banner withdrawn when Ukraine decided they weren't going to have Soviet battle honours in their units. But it's part of their legacy and their history. And at the second battle at Donetsk airport, they were one of the cyborg units that the Russians just couldn't beat in 2014. So they are a unit to be reckoned with, certainly adding to their illustrious battle honours and history in this. You could say, a brigade versus a battalion, you'd expect the brigade to win, but this was an obliteration.
Depending on your force organisations, brigades and battalions can be the same thing.
Yes, yeah. And in particular, the Russians have built their units around battalion combat teams, which doesn't seem to be going very well for them, but there's probably a lot of other reasons.
How many tanks were destroyed in this river crossing?
I thought it was about 70 of them. But,
there you go, 70 tanks, and that would not have been a fun day for them.
Yeah, certainly the pictures. There's a lot of destroyed tanks in these pictures.
And it's not just the tanks, there's also probably 1,000 to 1,500 troops that goes with them, and all the support vehicles as well.
Yeah.
And the engineering units.
But, let's step back for a second and take all of this with a grain of salt. I'm not saying this thing didn't happen, because there's a lot of supporting evidence it did. The Ukrainians have been extremely controlling of the
media presence of the war.
The media presence and the images that we see and what we hear about. So, a Ukrainian battalion could easily have been wiped out and we'd never hear about it. No. Although the Russians have got their own channels, but they, it's not certainly not been covered in English language press, and I don't speak Russian, so we're certainly not aware of quite the slaughter like this one was. But that's not to say it hasn't happened, and the Ukrainians are being extremely tight with how they manage the images and the stories that are coming out of the war. And that's not to be critical of them. It's just to say take it with a grain of salt with all these things.
The first casualty in war is truth.
Truth, yeah. And we are not hearing about Russian successes for obvious reasons. But when a storied unit of history, which I think the Ukrainian 17th Tank Brigade definitely deserve, has a really major success like this, you've got to give them a little salute. I don't wish well for the Russians in this Ukraine war, obviously. So stuff them. But
go home to your mothers, boys.
Yeah, go home to your mothers. I also don't have any animus against the Russian forces, because they didn't choose to do this. This is on Putin, and pretty much Putin alone.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's some cronies who are profiting off the war, but they he's
on both sides.
But my point is merely that one can enjoy having. Well, literally, this is the first tank-on-tank major engagement that we've heard about, so thought it was worth talking about. We still, our policy as a podcast is that we would prefer there not to be a war going on, even as
diplomacy
a tank podcast.
And yes, shipment of non-lethal aid to either side.
Yeah. Let's not get down the weeds of that one. That is beyond the remit of this podcast.
But we have influence. In all sorts of different ways.
Pacifism versus neutrality, armed neutrality. But
anyway, I think we've covered the M3 Lee. To sum it up, it was a strange tank. It was very useful for the stopgap tank that it was.
Yeah,
but it was probably could have been used better, and it was probably well liked by those using it, except the Russians.
It was just a weird moment when American industry said, we're just not quite ready to build
a 75mm gun in a turret.
And a year later, they were like...
We need 6 months to develop this, and everybody said, well, we need something right now.
Yeah.
And this is what we can give you.
Yeah, as I said at the start, it is a tank of very fine components. And some of them put together, extremely well. In particular, the fact that it was a heated tank.
Lots of machine guns, daka.
Well, lots of machine guns as built, but no way to actually aim them at the targets, which is problematic. We said before, when you're 14 years old, twin machine guns seems like a brilliant idea, but when you start, looking at the cost of the brass for the casings for the machine guns, you realise how about you have a weapon that can hit something?
I was about to say, it doesn't actually increase anything you can hit.
You can't miss your way to a hit. You get the same argument today with people like, oh, why don't warships have 15 cannons like back in the 100 years ago? And it's like, because they can hit what they need to hit with one cannon.
And that one cannon can fire 10 rounds a minute rather than one round every 5 minutes. Yeah.
So that's why.
and it still goes... So the 5-inch guns that fire that fast still go as far as the 16-inch guns that did back then.
Yeah, it's just better to hit the target. Yeah. Who would have thought? Okay, folks, we've kept this one under the 2-hour mark, so that's going to make my life easier doing the edit. If you're enjoying this podcast, do please go to Redbubble, search for Totally Tanked, only buy from the seller Totally Tanked, one word. We will totally appreciate that. And if you'll buy enough t-shirts, we're going to buy a universal carrier. So it's on you. And I promise, if any of you come to Canberra, we'll take you for a ride in it. Ha! How's that?
I think these are promises we won't have to keep, John.
Yeah, I don't think we can sell that many t-shirts, but I'm just throwing it out there, people.
Take care all, and we'll see you sometime soon.